Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. It's my distinct pleasure to have as our speaker here today David Hughes, who's come all the way from British Columbia to give this presentation. Dave is a true expert on energy past and energy futures. He currently is a fellow with the Post-Carbon Institute in California, but he lives in the coast of British Columbia. He also is the founder of Global Sustainability Research Incorporated. Before his retirement a few years ago, he worked for the Canadian government for 32 years. He worked for the Canadian Geological Survey and was very instrumental in fossil fuel issues in Canada. So he's an expert on things like shale gas, coal bed methane, coal itself, LNG exports, pipeline constructions, and pipeline issues. He's also extremely interested in energy, alternative energy, and how that fits into the overall package. So I say he's come from British Columbia for this. He's a native of Calgary. Went to his academic training at the University of Alberta, but in the last 4 years since retiring has done his work from British Columbia. And I just want to acknowledge that the funding to bring him in for this was paid for by the Agriculture, Energy and Environment program here at Cornell and by the David R. Atkinson Center for a Sustainable Future here at Cornell. Dave is particularly eager to handle questions at the end. I think he'll give a very nice talk, but at the end, please stay around if you're interested to interact. He would enjoy that. And at that point, I'm going to ask you to come a little closer to the front to make it more cordial. But in the meanwhile, please help me welcome Dave Hughes.
Great, thanks, Bob. Should probably start off with a mild apology for traveling 6,000 miles to give a talk on energy sustainability. But I hope I'll be able to shed some light on a few issues that will make it at least partially worth all that carbon. So I think everybody pretty much is aware in the general public of the whole issue of climate change. They may not be willing to do much in changing their lifestyles to accommodate it, but they at least know about it. And there's an equally important issue that I think we're facing as a society, which I term the energy sustainability dilemma. So what I'd like to do is define what I mean by the dilemma. And we can do that by looking at history. It's hard to argue with the data from the past. I'd also like to look at various forecasts of the future. So now this is not working here, Bob. There we go. It's easy to argue about forecasts, and I've tried to present the range of opinion about where we're going in the future from the optimist to the pessimist. The whole thing is really about the availability and deliverability of non-renewable fuels, oil, gas, coal, and uranium, and these are really what has fueled the growth in GDP, consumption, our civilization over the last couple of centuries. Electricity, which is really a derivative form of energy, very convenient, defines first world countries. The implications of population growth, and in particular, the aspirations of growth and consumption of the developing world going forward. And how do we go forward in an energy-constrained world? This is a finite planet. We can't keep growing forever. If you look at the last 10,000 years of human development, you can see that the human race is on a real roll. We're adding a city equivalent to 1 million people every 5 days to the population of the planet. We made it out of the last ice age with 3 million people. It took 6,500 years to triple that to 10 million. And that was really the advent of agriculture. At the time of Christ, we had a little more than 200 million people on the planet, 1 billion in 1810, 2.8 billion when I was born in 1950, and 7 billion in 2011. if we look at the correlation between population growth and consumption of fossil fuels in particular, we can see a very high degree of correlation. Coal got started in a fairly big way back in about 1700. Oil, 1858. Natural gas, 1885. And the correlation between population growth and energy consumption is a very high one. If we look at the last 4.5 decades of energy consumption, this is the British Petroleum Statistical Review of World Energy. Every year they publish this fantastic spreadsheet that goes back to 1965. And this is consumption by region. First of all, we can see that total consumption of energy has more than tripled since 1965, only 45 years. A huge growth in the Asia-Pacific region, the China, India, developing Asia. Lesser growth in Europe and North America because their levels of consumption are already very high. If we look at growth by fuel, oil, number one source of energy in the world, followed by coal and natural gas, and the balance, large hydro, nuclear, and this green sliver up at the top is non-hydro renewable energy. The bottom line is that in 2010, 84% of our primary energy was provided by fossil fuels. If we look at per capita consumption by fuel in the world, this goes back to 1850. We can see, first of all, that per capita energy consumption has increased by almost 800% since 1850. In 1850, it was about 82% biomass, renewable, wood, 18% coal. People consider coal a fuel of the 19th century, but in fact, it was a fuel of the 20th century, and in fact, it could be a fuel of the 21st. The average world citizen consumes the same amount of coal per capita as in 1910. Oil, the advent of oil really accelerated after the Second World War. And we can see that oil did not displace coal. Oil allowed us to consume even more energy. Natural gas, more still, and uranium, more still. It turns out that the average citizen of the world is consuming the same amount of world energy per capita, or renewable energy per capita today, as in 1850. 89% of our consumption is non-renewable. So this is the energy dilemma personified. A comparison between consumption levels in 2010 versus 1850. So we have 5.5 times as many people. Each person is consuming 8 times as much energy per capita. The world is consuming 49 times the consumption of 1850, 89% of which is non-renewable. Oil, gas, coal, and uranium. Cumulative consumption of fossil fuels by the human race, 1850 to 1910. We burned about 3 trillion barrels of oil equivalent in terms of coal, oil, and gas over that period of time. 90% of all fossil fuels have been burnt since 1937, and half of them since 1985. If we look at forecasts of the future, this is the Energy Information Administration in Washington. The reference economic case is 47% growth in energy consumption from 2010 to 2035. That's 25 years. Today, the OECD countries, the industrialized world, 18% of world population consumes 47% of the world's energy. Non-OECD countries, the developing world, is expected to be consuming 73% of the world's energy by 2035. If we look at the forecast by fuel, natural gas will be the fastest growing fuel source, followed by coal and oil in terms of fossil fuels, nuclear nearly double, large hydro and true renewables nearly double. But according to this forecast, 79% of world energy will be fossil fuels in 2035. What's going wrong with this? There. Just takes a couple of extra taps. So if we look at that forecast out to 2035, this is what global consumption of fossil fuels would look like in 2035. We'll have burned 5.2 trillion barrels of oil equivalent in terms of fossil fuels. And to fuel the next 25 years of fossil fuel consumption, we need the equivalent of 75% of all the oil, gas, and coal ever consumed by people up until year-end 2010. So a very aggressive forecast for just 25 years. A resource pyramid. I tell people that hydrocarbons are essentially infinite. However, we've been consuming the best quality hydrocarbons at the top of this pyramid. The conventional oil, gas, and coal. There's a fuzzy line that separates conventional from unconventional. Unconventional being things like shale gas, tar sands, extra heavy oil, gas hydrates, and so forth. There's a couple other lines on this pyramid. One is the price and technology line. So as the price goes up and the technology gets better, we can access more and more unconventional hydrocarbons. And then there's this solid line, which is the net energy line. And that's the amount of energy we have to expend for the energy in the hydrocarbons that we extract. And when we hit 1-to-1, everything below that line is an energy sink, not an energy source. So this is the ultimate barrier. If you remember 3 words in this lecture, remember these 3. Beware of scale. The 84% of primary energy provided by hydrocarbons is a lot of energy. Less than 2% of primary energy consumption is now provided by non-hydropower renewables. If you don't count biomass that's burned for heat and cooking. There are no scalable alternatives to hydrocarbons at the rates of energy throughput we enjoy at this point in time. Unconventional hydrocarbons, things like tar sands, biofuels, extra heavy oil, are difficult to scale. They take a lot of capital and money in order to grow production. So this is what I mean by beware of scale. This is 2010 consumption by fuel. Non-hydrocarbon renewables were less than 2% of production. And this is really electric, non-hydropower renewables. Most of that was biomass electric, wood burned for heat and other plant commodities. If we look at wind, wind had an exponential growth in generation over that period, but it's still adding up wind, solar, and geothermal is only 0.5% of primary energy consumption in 2010. So just to summarize, hydrocarbons, 84% of world consumption in 2010. The forecast suggests that won't change out to 2035 at least. Most of the balance of energy supply will be large hydro and nuclear sources with their own environmental problems. So the question is, how sustainable is this on a long-term basis? And I'd like to focus in more detail on oil, gas, and coal. So if we look at oil, I mentioned that we got started consuming oil. Actually in 1858 in Canada, people think it was 1859 in Titusville, Pennsylvania. As of year-end 2010, we burned about 1.2 trillion barrels of oil. We think we have another 1.2 trillion of discovered resources, and likely another 500 billion or more barrels yet to find. 90% of this oil has been burned since 1960, 50% since 1988, and 10% since 2006. So we're now burning about 32 billion barrels of oil per year. A great upward spiral in consumption of oil. If we look at the production and consumption of oil in the world over the last 4.5 decades, we can see, first of all, that the non-OPEC world outside of the former Soviet Union peaked in 2002, produced 42% of the world's oil in 2010, but it consumed 85% of it. OPEC, the OPEC cartel, produced 42% and consumed only 10%. The growth in domestic consumption of oil in OPEC countries is very high. Their demographics are quite young, and they have subsidies to make the consumption of oil very cheap. So the ability of OPEC countries to continue growing exports to non-OPEC countries is a question mark going forward. And the overall consumption of oil nearly tripled over 4.5 decades. If we look at forecasts of the future, the EIA forecasts their latest International Energy Outlook. Their reference case is a 32% growth in oil consumption through 2035. That would get us up to about 113 million barrels per day. The world is about 88 million barrels per day at present. So this is the EIA projection, their latest projection. This is a projection out of the International Energy Agency in Paris. They're much less bullish on growth in oil consumption. Their reference case is to get us up to about 99 million barrels per day by 2035. They also qualified that projection. They said it will take $8.5 trillion in investment in upstream oil and gas, not oil and gas, just oil infrastructure to get to that point by 2035. If we look at what's actually happened over the last decade with oil production, we can see that the world has been on a plateau since late 2004. So really an undulating plateau. It's grown slightly in the last few years. And this yellow sliver is surplus capacity. Extra production capacity that can be turned on at will. 95% of that capacity is in Saudi Arabia. The rest of the world is essentially flat out. Oil reserves in the world, 1980 to 2010, reported oil reserves. We can see that the OPEC cartel controls about 3/4 of the reported oil reserves. Non-OPEC, about 14%. The former Soviet Union, about 9%. If we look a bit closer at those reported oil reserves, these are 6 OPEC countries that control 2/3 of the world's oil reserves. This is our reported reserves, 1980 to 2010. We can see a big ramp up in the late 80s, at about the time that OPEC changed the way they set their production quotas. They set their production quotas based on reported reserves. And reported reserves went up by about 300 billion barrels without significant new discoveries. Venezuela doubled their reserves starting in about 2008. And many geologists would suggest that some of these reserves at least are political, not geological. Over this period of time, reported reserves have gone up by over 500 billion barrels. Countries like Saudi Arabia have flatlined their reported reserves since the late 80s. They produced 100 billion barrels of oil over that period, and their reserves never went down. We have no independent data to really validate what they're telling us. So some of those at least may not exist. How long will world oil reserves last at current production rates? The world as a whole, about 43 years. OPEC, if you believe their numbers, 85 years. former Soviet Union 25, and non-OPEC outside of the former Soviet Union about 15. Of course, we're going to find more oil as we go forward. A very compelling diagram for me. The green bars are the amount of oil that was discovered in each year. And it turns out that world oil discoveries peaked in 1965. The black line is the amount of oil consumed. And since about 1984, we've been consuming more oil than we've been discovering in each year. And we're now consuming 3 to 4 barrels of oil for every barrel that we're finding. Peak oil, world production peak, when will it happen? Debatable because of the variables. In my mind, it's only a question of when, not if. It depends on how much is there, which is a function of endowment, technology, and price, and so-called reserve appreciation as we drill more wells and find out more about the pools we have discovered. And it depends on rate of consumption, also a function of price, infrastructure, and depletion rates of the pools that we've discovered. There's been a lot of peaking that's gone on in the world up until the present. And these are all of the countries in the world that are past peak production. And the length of the bar is the percentage they're producing below peak. They're arranged in chronological order from when they peaked. The US was first, it peaked in 1970. It's now about 33% below peak. Countries like the UK and the North Sea, UK peaked in 1999, more than 50% below peak. Norway, 2001, Mexico, 2004, Denmark, 2004. These red countries are countries that are past peak. Venezuela, 1970, Iran, 1974, Iraq, 1979. You can argue that some of these are political peaks, and with more technology and investment, it could be reversed. The ones that are down 20 or 30% below peak likely will never be reversed. 25 of these countries peaked since 1993, 18 since 2000. 79% of 2010 production was from countries that are past peak. There's been many forecasts of when world oil will peak. This is one by Colin Campbell, made in 2009. He's suggesting world oil is already past peak, excluding biofuels. The IEA in Paris is suggesting the world is past peak production for conventional crude. But they're suggesting that the world can stay on a plateau for conventional crude with fields that we've discovered and not yet developed, and with crude oil yet to be found. And that all of the growth and production will come from natural gas liquids, unconventional oil, and things like biofuels. A whole slew of peak oil projections and non-peak oil projections. I've color-coded these. Green, no peak before 2030. Organizations like OPEC, Exxon, the EIA, the IEA, if you look at their less pessimistic projections. Yellow, a peak before 2030 and a gradual decline. Some multinational oil companies fall into this category. Total, 2020. Shell's worst case, 2020. And then a bunch of independent forecasters, typically projecting earlier peaks in red. One of these, Chris Grybowski, suggesting 2013 or 2012. This may have a little more credibility than most, in that Grybowski maintains a mega projects database. So a mega project is a project that will produce 100,000 barrels a day or more. Typically, it takes about 6 years from discovery to production. And Grybowski has looked at all of these mega projects and suggested that there will be enough new capacity coming online to offset depletion up until 2013. And after that, he doesn't see enough investment to offset depletion and suggests that the world could begin to go into decline. The projection of oil production, again, out of Washington, the EIA, I just like to point out unconventional oil. If we can nearly quadruple unconventional oil, it will still be a relatively small proportion of forecast consumption at that point in time. And many of the estimates of peak oil production are in a time frame before 2020. A few years back, President Bush, in a State of the Union address, said America's addicted to oil. And nothing could be more true. U.S. oil consumption has declined a couple million barrels per day because of the Great Recession, in essence. But the U.S. still imports about half of its oil production. Canada is a large exporter of oil to the U.S., mainly because of the tar sands. That's the only opportunity for growth in oil production in Canada. The U.S., or Mexico rather, has also increased its production radically. But as I mentioned, it peaked in 2004. Its consumption is growing quite rapidly. And people like Jeff Rubin, an economist at CIBC, suggests that Mexico will have no oil for export after about 2015. Considering that they need that money for their government revenues, that's a very serious outcome for Mexico. Imports into the U.S. by country, Canada, number one. In 2010, that was followed by Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, and Venezuela, and then Mexico. So the red countries are OPEC countries, and the green are non-OPEC countries. So about half of U.S. oil imports were provided by OPEC in 2010. North American reserve lifetime at current production rates. The U.S., about 11 years. Canada, 26, and this includes 26 billion barrels of tar sands under development. Mexico, 10. North America as a whole, about 15 years. Non-conventional oil, the EIA's forecast again. Biofuels, almost quadruple. Oil sands, bitumen, more than triple. Extra heavy oil out of Venezuela, more than double. Coal to liquids, up by 750%. If we can do all that, unconventional oil will be about 11.7% of forecast consumption in 2035. Important, yes. A panacea to offset the decline in conventional oil, no. The concept of net energy, the energy profit ratio, I mentioned it earlier with respect to the resource pyramid. An extremely important concept, the amount of energy we invest, drilling wells, building infrastructure, to recover the energy in whatever we extract. And as we go down the food chain, old conventional oil, the vertical wells in Saudi Arabia back in the 50s, had a net energy payback of about 100 to 1. New conventional oil, deep water oil, 3D seismic, much more energy intensive, about 25 to 1. Shale oil in North Dakota, really a result of fracking technology. The jury's still out on what the net energy payback of that is. Tar sands, somewhere between 3 and 5 to 1. Biodiesel, there's several opinions on biodiesel and ethanol. University of Minnesota would say that ethanol is net energy positive by about 1.25 to 1. So we burn a barrel to get a quarter of a barrel. Biodiesel from soybeans is about 2 to 1. So we burn a barrel to net out a barrel. Pimental and Patsec, much more pessimistic. They suggest that ethanol from corn is energy negative and that biodiesel is energy negative. The huge deposits in Colorado and Wyoming of oil shale have never been recovered at an energy profit, although there's a huge amount of hype about them. So it's really not about total amount of hydrocarbons in the ground. It's about the portion that you can extract at a net energy profit. Oil sands, 1.7 trillion barrels in place. The amount that might be extracted at a net energy profit may be 170 billion barrels. Oil shale, probably even less. Light oil, we can get about 70% of, or up to 70% of the light oil in place. So it's not a question of running out of resources. It's a question of how fast you can convert those resources into supply going forward. 32 billion barrels of throughput per year is a lot of oil. Fatty Birol, the chief economist at the IEA in Paris, used to really poo-poo peak oil. He became much more pessimistic in 2008. They did a top-down study of depletion rates in 400 of the largest oil pools in the world. And he was quoted in The Independent in 2009 as stating, even if demand remains steady, the world would have to find the equivalent of 4 Saudi Arabias to maintain production, and 6 Saudi Arabias if it is to keep up with the expected increase in demand between now and 2030. It's a big challenge in terms of geology, in terms of investment, and in terms of geopolitics. If we look at natural gas, this is cumulative consumption of natural gas up until year-end 2010. We've consumed much less energy equivalent in terms of natural gas as in terms of oil. The consumption profile is the same. 90% of natural gas has been consumed since 1966, 50% since 1992, and 10% since 2007. So the same uphill consumption spiral of natural gas as with oil. Consumption and production of natural gas in the world, generally much more balanced between production and consumption because of the difficulty in moving gas as LNG between continents. North America produced and consumed about a quarter of the world's gas in 2010. Former Soviet Union, a huge producer and consumer of gas, supplies a lot of gas to Europe. Overall consumption over the last 45 years, more than triple. Forecast of the future. The EIA, again, is suggesting that natural gas consumption can grow by 52% in the reference case through 2035. World gas reserves. The good news is there's lots of gas in the world. The bad news is it's not in North America. Only about 5% of remaining reserves were in North America in 2010. Roughly 3/4 are in the Middle East and former Soviet Union. How long will these natural gas reserves last at current production rates? The world, about 60 years. Europe, 10. North America, 12. And the rest of the world outside North America and Europe, about 100 years.
Is that conventional gas?
Conventional, and it's mostly conventional at this point in time. It doesn't include a lot of shale gas. I'll talk about shale gases in a few minutes. Natural gas is finite at some point. It's a non-renewable resource. This is Campbell's projection of a gas peak in the world. Much further out, this projection is 2045, including unconventional gas. If we look at the actual production profile of gas, we can see that natural gas is a story about declines. Declines are much more rapid than with oil. And this is 2006 US production by well vintage. So you can see the declines, 1 year old, 2 years old, 3 years old, 4 years old. In 2006, 60% of production was from wells drilled in the last 4 years. So the story of natural gas is that you have to keep drilling. Production declines overall for all gas wells in the US are about 32% per year. So you need to replace 32% of the production by more drilling. And that's called the law of diminishing returns. This is the last 2 decades of US gas production. The number of wells in black, so the number of gas wells operating has doubled. There's now over 500,000 operating gas wells in the US. The average productivity per well has declined by 36%, so more wells to maintain production going forward. Shale gas technology play that's really developed in the last decade or so. There's a huge amount of hype around shale gas. And these are some of the deposits that have been identified around the world, or around North America, rather. Marcellus up here, where you folks are. But it all got started in the Barnett Shale in East Texas. The Potential Gas Committee makes estimates of U.S. gas reserves every couple of years. Really, the only growth in gas reserves has been the projections in shale gas. And they're suggesting about a third of U.S. reserves are shale gas at this point in time. Those are more properly called resources. This is where people are getting 100 years of gas from. The EIA has become ever more optimistic on shale gas. We can see that, in essence, all sources of gas other than shale are largely in decline or on a plateau. Lower 48 offshore on a plateau, onshore associated with oil production in decline, conventional gas, including tight gas, in decline, coal bed methane in decline. Shale gas is projected to grow by more than fourfold by 2035. Canadian imports stop in 2021, and the U.S. becomes a net exporter of gas in 2021. Just to show you where the EIA has gone with its projections of shale gas over the last 4 years, their 2009 forecast was 16% of production by 2030, 2010, 26%, 2012, nearly half of U.S. production will come from shale. Shale gas is really a story about technology, multi-stage hydraulic fracturing of horizontal wells. Back in the early part of the last decade, maybe 1 out of 10 wells would have been horizontal. 2011, roughly 60% of all gas wells drilled were horizontal, multi-stage fracked wells. Shale gas production has really been a game changer in terms of U.S. gas supply. This is production by play up until June of 2011. The Marcellus currently is quite a small player in terms of all of the shale gas plays. The Haynesville in Louisiana is now the #1 shale gas producer. I don't know if I can go back. Let me just try. So shale gas is now about 30% of U.S. production. And it was almost zero back in 2004. So it's really growing incredibly. How has that happened? So the red line here is U.S. gas production. It is still rising. The previous peak used to be 1973. U.S. gas production has now exceeded that peak. The black line is number of wells drilled per year. In the 90s, about 10,000 gas wells were drilled per year. That tripled to about 34,000 per year up until the beginning of the Great Recession in 2008. Gas well drilling collapsed to about half those levels. Part of the reason for production increasing at this point in time, in my view, is a lot of these wells weren't tied in. So a lot of these wells are being tied into pipelines causing some of that growth. There's still quite a bit of drilling to maintain lease commitments. That is ending as we speak. At current gas prices, I expect gas production to begin falling. And the reason for that is the rig count for gas is falling quite rapidly now. The total rig count is almost at a pre-Great Recession high. A lot of those rigs are turning to fracking oil-rich reservoirs and away from gas. And associated gas with that drilling can really make money, even at $2 an MCF. But I expect this is going to take its toll in U.S. gas production. And ultimately, prices have to rise for production to continue to rise. This is what fracking for oil in North Dakota looks like. Just an incredible explosion in the number of wells and in production. So production is now about 500,000 barrels per day out of North Dakota, which is really a phenomenal increase, remembering that the U.S. consumes about 19 million barrels per day. So it's not really a panacea in terms of total production. What did it take in order to grow oil production that much? You can see that since it bottomed out in about 2009, the number of oil wells drilled has doubled. So growing oil production this much has really required a doubling in terms of the number of oil wells. Some groups like Citibank like to project this growth in oil production to the point where the U.S. will have no oil imports. But in fact, we're up about 600,000 barrels per day over the all-time low in U.S. oil production. The U.S. is now back to about 2003 levels. Fracking. This is a frack job at the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, which is under land by shale gas. Huge investment. I counted 39 pumper trucks on this frack job. And this is the plan for the Dallas-Fort Worth property. So in essence, a whole systematic development of a web of horizontal wells to drain all of that gas. The black dots are drilling pads. There's many optimists on shale gas. I've been in my hotel room, now that I can actually get CNN, watching the ads by ANGA, the North American Gas Alliance in Washington. It seemed to run them about every 15 minutes. T. Boone Pickens, another big promoter of gas. And this is off of Pickens' website. There's so much natural gas that there's enough available, according to one researcher, to displace half of the coal-burning power plants in the U.S. by 2020. We have the domestic natural gas necessary to fuel our trucks and fleet vehicles. Pickens. Studies from prestigious energy firms and universities have affirmed the dream of clean, abundant, homegrown energy is now reality with the help of shale gas. ANGA. I believe U.S. natural gas producers can increase supplies by 5% per year for at least the next decade, and that assumes there's no more access to public lands and waters than there is today. McClendon, CEO of Chesapeake, his testimony to Congress in 2008. If you could do that, that would be a 63% growth in gas production. The EIA doesn't buy it. This is their 2012 reference case forecast by sector for natural gas consumption. Electricity is going to grow by 30% from natural gas, but its market share only grows by 4%. Compressed natural gas vehicles will grow a lot, but still be negligible in terms of displacing oil for transportation. Industrial and commercial up a bit, residential down. Likely you don't have to heat those foreclosed homes quite as much. Arthur Berman on shale gas. Art Berman is one of the real pessimists on shale gas. And this is from his PowerPoint in ASPO in 2010. Shale plays are marginally commercial at best. The plays have consistently contracted to core areas that represent 10 to 20% of the resource that was initially claimed. The manufacturing model has failed. And it used to be that people thought that you could just drill anywhere within a shale play and the wells would be equally productive. These are not low-cost plays. The marginal cost of production for most companies is $7.50 an MCF. Reserves have been greatly overstated, and 80% of booked reserves are undeveloped. And this is what Art meant by core areas. And even McLennan is a subscriber to core areas. The more wells you drill, the more you find out that geology is important. And all of these areas are not equally productive. McLennan basically said, this is 2009, there was a time when you were told that any of the 17 counties in the Barnett Shale would be just as good as any other county. We found that there are about 2.5 counties where you really want to be. And that the same thing is happening with the Marcellus in Pennsylvania, with the Haynesville in Louisiana. Shale plays have very high decline rates. The first year decline rate in the Haynesville is about 85%. In the Barnett, it's about 65%. So really, if anything, shale plays accelerate the treadmill in terms of the number of wells that have to be drilled in order to keep production up. The ever-optimistic EIA, this is past amounts of drilling. I showed you that peak before the Great Recession. It collapsed. The EIA thinks that production can keep growing with about half the number of wells being drilled as that peak. My projection would be that if we follow this pattern of drilling, gas production will follow this pattern of production. In order to keep growing production per the EIA forecast, I think we're going to have to get back up to about 30,000 wells per year and grow it going forward. Gas price, the EIA suggests that gas will be low priced for the foreseeable future. This is their price projection for gas, and that production can keep growing. It turns out that North America is a real anomaly in terms of gas price. This is imported LNG into Japan. They're now paying $19 an MCF. Gas price in Russia, this is Russian gas exported to Europe, is over $12 an MCF. Gas price in North America is about $2 as we speak. So a real anomaly, which is why people are talking about building LNG export facilities to capture that price. There's no free lunch with shale gas, and in fact with any gas. This was a study done out of Duke, published last year, suggesting that they have found abnormally high levels of methane in groundwater within 1,000 meters of gas wells. So this is not just fracking, this is all gas wells. And this is primarily well engineering, likely near surface casing failures, cement failures, and so forth. Bob Howarth, Tony Ingraffia, and Renee published a forecast that said that shale gas was worse than coal from a greenhouse gas emissions point of view back in April of 2011. A month later, Timothy Scone from the National Energy Technology Laboratory came to Cornell and gave a talk and suggested that the Howarth et al. Study was not correct, and in fact, natural gas has much lower emissions than coal. So I decided I'd look at that in a little more detail and see what was going on. And one of the things that the Nettle comparison looked at all gas, not just shale gas, which is what what Bob Howard's study had done. And if you dissociate it by gas source, you can find that conventional sources generally have very low methane emissions compared to unconventional gas, shale gas and tight gas. I compared the average methane emissions from Nettle's study to the EPA emissions from 2009 and adjusted them accordingly. The average emissions from the Nettle study were actually quite a bit lower than the EPA emissions, so I thought we should at least try to match the EPA. And it also depends on how much gas those wells produce over their lifetime. If the emissions are X and total production is, say, 3 BCF, which is what Nettle assumed, that gives you a fairly low total lifetime percentage of methane emissions. But in fact, the EIA's estimate of Barnett ultimate recovery is half of what Nettle assumed. And if you adjust those to the EPA average emissions, they fall exactly within the low and high estimates of Bob Howard's study. So they're basically saying exactly the same thing. So if you compare coal to gas, it really depends on the lifespan that you're comparing it over, because methane has a much shorter residency time in the atmosphere than CO2. And this is the number of times that methane is worse basically than CO2. So 20 years is on the right, 100 years is on the left. The solid lines are conventional gas and conventional coal, the existing fleets. And it turns out that the existing fleets of natural gas are worse than coal, probably out to about 30 to 35 years. The incremental technology, the incremental capacity that's brought on will be best of class technology. And with best of class technologies, shale gas is worse than coal out to about 50 years probably. So it's no panacea to offset production of greenhouse gas emissions. If we look at the concept of net energy for natural gas, it's just as important as with coal. Old conventional gas had a very high net energy payback. New conventional gas, tight gas, is much lower. Coal bed methane is typically a lot of very low productivity wells. Shale gas, the jury's out on shale gas. I don't think we really know what the lifetime production of some of those wells will be. I think it's quite positive in terms of net energy, but we're not sure exactly how positive. Gas hydrates, nobody has produced any gas hydrates at a net energy profit to date, even though the resources in place are huge. If we look at coal, cumulative consumption of coal, by the human race, we've consumed more energy in terms of coal than we have in terms of oil or gas. As I mentioned, coal was the fuel of the 20th century. 90% of all the coal consumed has been consumed since 1911, half of it since 1975, and 10% since 2006. So an incredible growth in consumption of coal in the world. If we look at production and consumption of coal by region, we can see that the Asia-Pacific region is a huge producer and consumer of coal. China, India, Australia, major producers. North America is also a major producer and consumer of coal. Projections for the future. Reference case EIA projections for coal consumption is up by 50% by 2035. There's been several studies of when world coal production will peak. This is one of them by Energy Watch Group out of Germany, suggesting a global peak in coal production in 2025, a peak in China, the biggest coal producer in the world, before 2025. Another one out of Uppsala in Sweden, suggesting peak coal in 2030. Another out of Australia, And it really depends on what the ultimate recoverable coal reserves will be. 700 billion tons ultimate, we're past peak at this point. If there's 1.1 billion tons recoverable, world coal would peak in 2034. A study I find very compelling is out of Caltech by a fellow by the name of Dave Rutledge. And he looked at production peaks of coal and oil and gas. And this is his projection. I like the way he used Hubbard linearization to compute the ultimate recoverable based on the history of production. And he's suggesting peak coal in 2022, combined peak of oil and gas in 2019, and a peak of all hydrocarbons in the world in 2020. And in terms of remaining recoverable hydrocarbons, this is what that projection would look like. When I was born in 1950, 95% of ultimate recoverable hydrocarbons remain to be produced. Today, we've consumed about 42%, 58% remaining. If we keep producing them and consuming them as fast as they can be produced, half will be gone in 2017, 80% gone in 2050, and 98% gone in 2100. That's a very important projection because, as I like to point out, there's no replacement for hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons are really used to build whatever infrastructure comes next. For example, a 2 megawatt windmill has about 260 tons of steel in it, made from 300 tons of iron ore and 170 tons of coking coal. So the coking coal and the iron ore is all mined, extracted, and transported by hydrocarbons, as are the windmills themselves, in terms of maintenance and so forth going forward. So hydrocarbons are critical for building an infrastructure that has a much lower energy footprint going forward. Caltech looked at the IPCC projections of CO2 in the atmosphere and suggested there's not enough recoverable hydrocarbons to even get to the lowest IPCC scenario. There's about 40 of these different scenarios that IPCC developed back in around 2000. The reason there's such great differences is the IPCC assumed there's essentially no limits to the amount of recoverable hydrocarbons that can be recovered and burned. And this is a comparison of the IPCC projections to 2100 to the Caltech projections. Roughly 7 times as much recoverable hydrocarbon. Caltech suggested that their production scenarios for hydrocarbons would get us to 450 ppm in the atmosphere, and that would happen in about 2062. So that's enough to get us to the 2 degrees centigrade threshold, danger threshold for climate change. And this is where we're at in terms of climate change at present. The red line is the Hadley Meteorological Center's data set on world temperature. We're now at about 0.8 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, so we've got about 1.2 degrees to go to get to the danger threshold. The black line is the cumulative consumption of hydrocarbons since we got started. And as I mentioned, 90% burned since 2037, 50% burned since 1985. So the anthropogenic part of this temperature record is likely the last 60 or so years of hydrocarbon consumption. If we look at electricity, the last couple decades of generation of electricity in the world, much more rapid growth in generation in the developing, or in the world as a whole, than in North America, because generation in North America is already at very high levels. Huge growth in the Asia Pacific in terms of electricity generation. Forecasts of the future by economic development So the OECD countries generate about 53% of the world's electricity at present, 18% of world population. They will be generating only about 40% of a much expanded amount of electricity by 2035. So the world as a whole will nearly double in terms of this forecast. If we look at forecasts by fuel, coal is projected to be the most important fuel source for electricity worldwide, out to 2035 at least. Natural gas doubles and increases market share. Nuclear nearly doubles. Large hydro nearly doubles. Non-hydro renewables up by nearly fivefold. And if non-hydro renewables can grow by fivefold, they'll be about 7% of total world generation by 2035. This is what the portfolio of non-hydropower renewables looks like in that forecast. Wind will be most important, growing by nearly 600%, followed by biomass and all other renewables at triple. If we grow solar PV and concentrated solar by 14-fold, it will still only be about 0.5% of world generation. Geothermal, more than triple, will be about 0.5%. So very aggressive growth forecast, but still relatively insignificant amounts of generation. So beware of scale again with renewables. US generation by fuel. Again, coal will lose market share going forward, but it will still grow slightly in real terms. It'll go from about 44% of generation at present to 39% in this forecast. Natural gas up by 49%, so it gains market share at the expense of coal. Nuclear up a bit, but loses market share. Large hydro up a bit, but loses market share. Non-hydro renewables more than triple to about 9% of total generation by 2035. If we look at non-hydro renewables, we can see that the use of biomass to generate electricity is the most important source of non-hydro renewable energy, up by more than triple. Wind, nearly triple, up to about 3.8% of total generation. Solar, up by 13-fold, and it could be 0.9% of generation. Geothermal, more than triple, a little under 1%, 9.4% total. If we look at wind in the US, we can see there's been a huge, basically exponential growth in installation of wind, especially over the past decade. This goes up to 2008, but in fact, it has continued over the last couple of years. But if we look at the installed capacity compared to the amount of electricity we've actually got out of that capacity, it's only about 31% because of intermittency. 69% of the installed wind capacity has been unutilized, basically because wind doesn't blow all the time. That's a pretty good capacity factor, 31%. A lot of the better wind sites have been developed. What about nuclear? Nuclear energy has been said to be a panacea by some, but in fact, a lot of the installed capacity of nuclear in the world, there's about 440 nuclear reactors in the world, were built back in the 70s and 80s with a 40-year lifespan. Some of those have had life extension in the US, another 20 years. That would get them to 60. But ultimately, that capacity is going to have to be replaced with new reactors or somehow repowered. And this is the trajectory. How many new nuclear reactors do we need to keep nuclear capacity flat? And we need about 283 new reactors out to 2030 in order to just keep nuclear generation flat going forward. We're not building enough. There's somewhere between 50 and 60 new reactors under construction in the world at present. And we're not commissioning enough of them per year, even to keep capacity flat, let alone replace a lot of fossil-generated electricity. The last piece of the puzzle, in my view, is the whole issue of population growth, and in particular, aspirations of growth and consumption in the developing world. If you look at different countries in the world, we can see that there's a great inequity in terms of per capita consumption. And I've drawn a line here. This is the world average. The US, let's see if we can go back to that. The US basically consumes 4.2 times the world average on a per capita basis. It consumes 2.1 times the European Union, 17 times India, and 49 times Bangladesh. 78% of the world is on this side of that line, basically China's consumption. 22% is on this side. The problem is that these people aspire to first world levels of consumption. The industrialized world, the OECD world, 18% of population, consumes 4 times as much energy per capita as the developing world. If we look at oil, there's even greater disparity in consumption of oil per capita. The US consumes about 5 times the world average in terms of oil consumption. So the average person in the US consumes about 23 barrels of oil per year. Consumes 9 times China, 22 times India, and 96 times Bangladesh. Developing, and the industrialized world, the OECD world, consumes 5 times the oil of the non-OECD world. If we look at the developing world, this is China, the world's #1 consumer of energy in the world. We can see a huge amount of coal, and a lot of the consumption and production of growth in terms of coal has come out of China. China is now importing 7% of its consumption at present. It's actually a net coal importer at this point in time. Its consumption is up by more than 5-fold, nearly 6-fold, since 1981, over 3 decades. Oil into China. China was a net oil exporter up until about 1993, became an importer. In 2010, 55% of China's oil demand was met by imports. So roughly 6% of world oil consumption is now imports into China, in competition with all of the other countries in the world that import oil. India, in 2010, 3/4 of India's oil was imported. If we look at history and forecast in terms of per capita consumption of energy, we can see how far the US and Canada are above the world average. China, because of all of that coal, is pretty much at the world average. But industrialized countries like Canada and the US are far higher than the developing world, although they're projected to grow. We can learn a lot from Europe in terms of how to reduce per capita energy requirements in North America. Total energy consumption. China became the world's largest consumer of energy in 2010. That's projected to continue going forward. If we look at CO2 emissions, we can see how much higher the industrialized world is than the developing world. The US and Canada are roughly 4 times the world average, close to 20 tons per capita in the world. China has now exceeded the world average in terms of per capita CO2 emissions. Total CO2 emissions. Because of all that coal, China became the world's biggest emitter in 2006 in terms of total emissions. World population increase. This is a forecast out of the US Bureau of Census, suggesting more than 9 billion people on the planet by 2050. As we go toward a plateau in world population, the percentage increase will decrease. The net number of people will decrease, but as I mentioned at the outset, we're adding the equivalent of a city of 1 million people every 5 days to world population. If we look at cars, the number of motor vehicles in the world exceeded 1 billion in 2010. A quarter of those were in the US, about 256 million. Only 70 million in China in 2009. China is now the world's biggest car market. And so cars in China are growing at about 20% per year. Motor vehicles are increasing at a much faster rate than people in the world. In 2009, 62 million new motor vehicles were built, almost the same number of net people added to the planet. If we look at food, how do we feed all those people? This is really the net energy for different ways to get food. Strategies like feedlot beef are very inefficient. They require a lot of hydrocarbons, diesel fuel, antibiotics, pesticides, nitrogen-based fertilizers to grow the food. Distant fishing, a very inefficient way to get food. So this is really the number of hydrocarbon units of energy in versus food units of energy out. Coastal fishing, much more efficient. Range-fed beef, very efficient. Trajectory of the US food system has gone from 1-to-1 in 2010 to about 10-to-1 at present. So we're dependent on hydrocarbons for a lot more than just transportation. The correlation of food price to oil price, a very high degree of correlation. In a scenario of peak oil, the price of oil is set to become much more volatile and likely much higher, along with the price of food. So the geopolitical implications of that are very serious going forward. So if we look back at that forecast I showed you out of the EIA at the beginning of the talk, this is what it would look like in 2035 if it could actually happen. And that was a 47% growth in consumption, 2010 to 2035. So if we compare it back to 1850, the world will have 6.8 times as many people in it. Each person consuming 9.6 times as much energy as in 1850. A world that consumes 65 times as much energy. 89% of it non-renewable. So things really haven't changed much. And I think that those forecasts are highly unlikely to happen. They're basically demand-based forecasts, assuming that the energy will be available to fill in under those curves. An economist I really like, good old Ken Boulding, made some great statements back in the early 70s. This is one of his best, I think. Anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. Al Bartlett, an emeritus professor at the University of Boulder in Colorado, he's given, last count, he'd given 1,600 talks on exponential growth to students and the whole issues around exponential growth. The term sustainable growth is an oxymoron. At some level, it has to be with finite resources. So just to summarize, in my view, achieving a sustainable energy system is likely to be the defining issue of our time as the economic growth paradigm abuts physical limits to growth. In an era of constrained energy, the correlation of economic growth with energy supply and price will set the stage for economic and geopolitical volatility and intense competition for energy resources. And we're already seeing that to a certain extent in the world. The climate change dialogue, for the most part, excludes any consideration of resource limitations on growth, and hence leads us down some counterproductive pathways. Although initiatives on conservation, efficiency, and renewables fortuitously also address the energy question. Hydrocarbons represent an extremely convenient, dense form of non-renewable energy for which there are no scalable alternatives. They will be needed for the development of infrastructure for the next paradigm of more sustainable human development. A sustainable energy future is not out of reach, but will be hugely challenging. I was in Japan and bit my tongue before I said it would be several Manhattan projects. The US and Canada have no real energy strategy. This has to be of the highest priority for our future. So thank you, and here's a view from my porch on Cortez Island where I contemplate all this stuff.
There's no more left to buy and sell. There's no more oil left in the well. A gallon of gas can be purchased